Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are revisiting AMD's FX 8370, and it's been quite some time since I dusted off our old AMD FX test system for some benchmarks. In fact, it was about 2 years ago that I last looked at it. And coincidentally, Longhair Steve from Gamers Nexus also recently revisited the FX 8370, and he also took the opportunity to finally come out of the closet and admit he's a long-time FX user. I'll admit the news hit me quite hard at first, but we're not ones to pass judgment, and we accept Steve for whatever he decides to install in his home PC, even if it is an AMD FX processor. Anyway, recovering from the shock, I did joke about it with Steve on Twitter, and after all, it really isn't that much of a big deal. The guy basically lives in his office. But all of this did prompt me to finally take a look back at AMD's FX series, namely the FX 8370, and this is also something many of you have been asking me to do for quite some time now. But rather than just copy what Longhair Steve's already done, because they did an excellent job with their content, I'm going to look at GPU scaling performance, and this is the same angle I took 2 years ago. Back then I put together an upgrade guide of sorts, I suppose, looking at how the FX 8370 and Core i5-2500K compared with the Ryzen 5 1400, 1200, and Pentium G4560. All processors that could be overclocked were, and we ended up with some pretty interesting results. For that testing I used the GeForce GTX 1060 6GB, GTX 1070, and GTX 1080. For the most part, the FX 8370 was slower than even the Ryzen 3 1200, and that's with both parts overclocked, and in many games the FX processor limited performance even with the GTX 1070. And this means for years now we've had access to faster, cheaper, and much more efficient processors for gamers. So naturally you can expect that things have only progressed further in the last 2 years or so since that testing. For today's testing, I'll be using the scaling data we already have for the Ryzen 7 1700, Ryzen 3 3300X, and Ryzen 5 3600. And those parts should make for an interesting comparison. None of those CPUs were overclocked, so I'll be sticking with stock performance. But the FX 8370 was paired with DDR3 2400 CL11 memory, while the newer processors use DDR4 3200 CL14 memory. Other than that, the GPUs used this time for testing include the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti, RTX 2070 Super, RTX 2060, and the GTX 1650 Super. Okay, let's get into the graphs. First up, we'll start by looking at the Far Cry New Dawn results, and here we have some pretty interesting numbers. Please note we don't use the built-in benchmark, rather this is gameplay from the first level. Now, we have seen previously that the cache and memory latency improvements of the Zen 2 architecture offer big gains over Zen and Zen Plus processors in Far Cry New Dawn, but here we're seeing that those earlier Zen processors are still a massive upgrade over the FX 8370. With the RTX 2080 Ti, we're looking at a massive 51% performance uptick for the R7 1700 over the FX 8370, and more crucially, frame rates are now above 60 FPS. Then, from the FX CPU to the Ryzen 3 3300X, we're looking at an 81% increase in performance as the average frame rate jumps from 57 FPS to 103 FPS. And similar gains were also seen with the RTX 2070 Super and RTX 2060. As incredible as those performance gains are, it's the GTX 1650 Super numbers that are perhaps the most surprising. Using this low-end GPU, the Ryzen processors were still up to 53% faster when comparing the 1% low data. That's just how slow the FX 8370 is. Now, if we reduce the GPU bottleneck and shoot for higher frame rates with the medium quality settings, we do see a rather significant 26% performance uplift with the FX 8370 when compared to the Ultra settings, and that sees it deliver over 60 FPS at all times, so a very playable experience then. However, under the same conditions, the R7 1700 was up to 101% faster, and at least 58% faster when comparing the 1% low data. Of course, the R3 3300X and R5 3600 are faster again, delivering up to 189% more frames, and again, this was also seen with the RTX 2070 Super and even the RTX 2060. Though it is once again the GTX 1650 Super results that are the most shocking, given we should be almost entirely GPU limited here, and we would be with any modern processor. The 3300X though was at least 89% faster than the FX 8370, a truly incredible performance uplift and certainly a massive upgrade for anyone still using an old FX processor. Moving on to the Rainbow Six Siege results, and here the FX 8370 fares much better. In fact, the performance is rather impressive. The R7 1700 was just 24% faster when using the RTX 2080 Ti, and that might actually be somewhat of a meaningless margin given the FX processor allowed for over 170 FPS at all times. And the same was also true when comparing it to the 3300X, which was 55% faster. The FX processor also trailed by a rather large margin with the RTX 2070 Super, but then it mostly caught up with the RTX 2060 and GTX 1650 Super, so not a terrible result overall by any means. The margins at the high end did grow a little bit with the medium quality settings, but interestingly, with the GTX 1650 Super, the FX 8370 was able to catch up. Again, pretty impressive frame rates, though we are using the Vulkan API, and that is an extension of the Mantle API, which was always a bit of a saving grace for the FX series. Shadow of the Tomb Raider requires a lot of CPU horsepower, and here we're again not using the built-in benchmark, but rather actual gameplay about 4 hours into the campaign. Here the FX 8370 really struggled and performance was noticeably poor even with an RTX 2080 Ti. The 1% low performance of the R7 1700 was 156% greater, and that margin was again seen with the RTX 2070 Super. In fact, even with the GTX 1650 Super, the FX processor was quite a bit slower than the newer Ryzen processors. We also see that in this particular title, reducing the quality preset doesn't help to alleviate the CPU bottleneck, and as a result the medium quality preset still saw the FX processor struggling, again delivering very laggy frame rates. Basically, you'd really only need an entry-level GPU that's only capable of 30 to 40 FPS with this low tier preset to get the most out of the FX 8370. Gears Tactics really isn't a title that requires big frame rates, so the FX 8370 really is enough, though the load times were painfully slow. With the GTX 1650 Super, it wasn't a great deal slower than the Ryzen processors, though with faster GPUs we did see the margin grow to over 90% in favour of the 3300X and 3600. Lowering the quality settings did help out the FX 8370, allowing the GPU to render a few more frames, and now we're looking at around 70 FPS on average with a 1% low of about 60 FPS. Not bad, but the R7 1700 was up to 101% faster, and the 3300X 189% faster. World War Z is another title that supports the Vulkan API, and on top of that it's not hugely CPU demanding, and this has allowed the FX 8370 to push over 80 FPS with an average of just over 100 FPS when using a high-end GPU. So certainly very playable performance despite the R7 1700 delivering up to 63% more frames, and the 3300X 102% more frames. That said, those margins were almost entirely eliminated with the GTX 1650 Super as the game becomes almost entirely GPU bound. Dropping down to the medium quality preset doesn't really change much here. With the RTX 2080 Ti, we're looking at very similar margins. That said, the lower quality visuals do provide the RTX 2070 Super and RTX 2060 with a little extra breathing room, so the margins here are slightly extended. Finally, we have Borderlands 3, and this is another game that isn't super CPU demanding, at least for the most part. And here the FX 8370 again does surprisingly well. With lower tier GPUs such as the RTX 2060 and GTX 1650 Super, it's really not much slower than the newer Ryzen processors. So for those more realistic GPU combos, you won't see much of a performance boost when upgrading. That said, those of you shooting for higher end GPUs, you will see up to a 42% performance boost with the R7 1700 and 52% more with the R5 3600. Reducing the quality preset to medium does help out the FX 8370 a little bit, and now we're seeing a further 16% performance boost as the average frame rate peaked at 117 FPS. So again, although the Ryzen processors are much faster here, the FX processor does surprisingly well, and we see that if you're using a GTX 1650 Super or slower, the newer Ryzen processors won't offer a significant performance uplift, at least in terms of FPS performance. I should note that the game itself did seem to load much faster when using the Ryzen processors, as did the levels. Well, there you have it. The FX 8370 certainly is a mixed bag, but then that's always really been the case. We saw in titles such as Borderlands 3, Rainbow Six Siege, and World War Z that the performance was actually quite good. In fact, in many instances, when paired with a lower-end GPU such as the GTX 1650 Super, which is comparable to something like a Radeon RX 58590 or a GTX 1060 for example, the FX processor was roughly on par with the newer Ryzen models. Of course, this was due to a strong GPU bottleneck in games that aren't very CPU demanding. In other titles such as Far Cry New Dawn, which is memory bandwidth and latency sensitive, the FX 8370 really struggled, and the same is also true for Gears Tactics. But where the FX processor fell flat on its face was when trying to play Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This CPU demanding title crushed the supposed 8-core processor, basically rendering it unable to deliver playable performance, or at the very least performance that wasn't horribly laggy. Truth be told though, Intel's own offerings of the time, such as the Core i5-2500K, might not fare any better, though 2 years ago we did find that the Core i5 part was on par with the quad-core Zen processors, so this is something that I'll have to re-explore soon. I guess the point I'm trying to make is the FX 8370 isn't looking very future-proof in these more modern CPU-demanding titles, and I doubt, for example, that we'll see the same thing happen to the Ryzen 7 1700 anytime soon. One of the biggest problems the FX series faced in its battle with Intel's second-gen core family was power efficiency. And part of this was because back then dual-core CPUs worked just fine for all games, and this meant FX processors like the 8370 were often competing with Core i3 parts using well under half as much power. Meanwhile, processors such as the Core i7-2600K, which are significantly faster, still used a lot less power. As an example, in our Shadow of the Tomb Raider test, the FX 8370 saw system consumption average out at 347 watts, while under the same conditions, with the same hardware configuration, the 2600K averaged just 275 watts and delivered substantially more performance, which we'll probably look at soon in an upcoming video. The 2600K, of course, cost a heck of a lot more, but that's not really the point we're making here. The FX 8370, and I guess all FX processors for that matter, just weren't good options for gamers, and really should have been avoided at just about all costs. From 2011 to 2014, you were better off with a cheaper dual-core Sandy or Ivy Bridge Core i3, and it really would have been at least 3 years before the FX 8370 might have started to nudge ahead in some games. Today though, those dual-core i3s would be a mess in basically everything, so the FX 8370 has certainly aged better in that sense. You just had to hold on to it for about 6 to 9 years before you could say I told you so. And with that, I'm going to end this video. If you did enjoy this look back at the 8370, the GPU scaling benchmarks, then hit that like button, subscribe for more content like this. And if you'd like to become part of the Hardware Unboxed community, join us over on Patreon. The link for that is in the video description. You'll get access to our monthly live streams, Discord chat, Q&As, behind the scenes videos. Anyway, if you're interested, check it out. But above all else, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve. I'll see you again next time.